Hello, everyone. Can whatever miking needs to happen, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to everyone for coming out this afternoon. Thank you so much to Molly for the wonderful introduction. Okay, so my talk today is called Among Ghost Dances, Sarah Winnemucca and the Production of Tribal Identity. This is part of a chapter of a book project I'm currently working on called Speaking for the People, Representativity and the Forms of Indigenous Self-Determination. In the late 1860s and the late 1880s, prophet-led movements emerged out of and extended across the Great Basin and into California, the Columbian Plateau, down into the Colorado River and onto the plains, emanating from visions of native regeneration dreamed by northern Paiute men, Wadziwab of the Walker River Reservation and Wovoka of the Yarrington Band. While the most famous and well-documented such movements in the late 19th century, the ghost dances of 1870 and 1890 as they have come to be known, can be understood less in terms of particular sets of ideologies or principles that derive from a single prophet figure, than as part and parcel of a broader set of socio-spiritual dynamics that were prevalent throughout the region during the entire period, and that were of a piece with a range of other prophet-led movements that preceded and were concurrent with those that came to be labeled as a ghost dance. As Gregory Smoke suggests, quote, "The ghost dances were an appeal to spiritual power to overturn a world that was not of their making." And he continues, quote, "The ghost dances were not two discrete movements, but rather two periods of intense excitement in a continuing pattern of religious practice that stretched throughout the 19th century and survives to this day," end quote. Yet in Sarah Winnemucca's Life Among the Paiutes, published in 1883, she does not discuss these movements at all. Not only is this omission quite notable, given that the text addresses northern Paiute politics and history, reaching from the 1840s to the 1880s, which includes the widespread response to Wadziwab's visions starting in 1869, but two of the central people in the narrative were known to be shamans and to have participated in prophet movements, Winnemucca's father and Oitz, who I'll talk about in a moment, both of whom appear as important leaders in the narrative. So in other words, she would have been well aware of not only the ghost dance of 1870, but of ghost dance movements, the larger prophet movements throughout the region, that she knew people who were immersed in them. People who were important in the narrative were immersed in them in various ways, and we get a discussion of them in the narrative basically nowhere. This is curious, and I wanted to think more about that. Many scholars have noted that Winnemucca draws on forms of presentation that would be familiar to white readers in order to advocate for the Paiute people. But what precisely is the entity in whose name or in whose stead Winnemucca is said to speak? Winnemucca's text seeks to ameliorate the violence of the colonial context of the late 19th century reservation system by drawing on the terms of Indian policy to offer a version of Paiute collectivity for which she can advocate with non-native publics and government officials. If one does not assume the existence of a singular political body for which Winnemucca speaks, though, her speech can be understood as actively working to generate a sense of cohesive northern Paiute nationhood. Winnemucca's narrative cites and circulates extant discourses of representativity in ways that draw on the forms of indigenous collectivity, governance, and territoriality already at play in Indian policy, such as having a singular leadership on a clearly delineated land base that is cleanly differentiated from that of other tribes. Life Among the Paiutes helps generate a sense of overarching Paiute peoplehood, of Paiute's identity as a tribe, in Winnemucca's claims to speak for this group. And that impression of Winnemucca's representativity enables the text to do particular kinds of public and political work. So if we don't already take the Northern Paiutes or the Paiutes as an entity for whom she is speaking, we can see her speaking as if she simply represented this already existing entity, as actually helping discursively constitute the entity in whose name she speaks. The character contours and geographies of indigeneity at work in prophet movements and associated spiritual practices, though, differ greatly from the centralization of political authority and reification of tribal identities and boundaries at play in U.S. Indian policy, particularly the reservation system. As these prophet movements took shape in the Great Basin and adjacent areas in the last decades of the 19th century, They contested the geographies of the reservation system, challenged the demarcation of tribal entities in US administrative mappings, and bypassed the kinds of political leadership on which federal Indian policy relied. Such movements were not more authentically native than the vision of tribal identity Winnemucca offers in her narrative, nor were prophet movements more representative of true native sentiments or processes of political imagination. Rather, the disparate modes of indigenous collective identification and self-identification at play in Winnemucca's text and the ghost dances arise in the midst of the same institutional, demographic, and ecological pressures. The issue then is not which one better captures the will of the Paiute people. Instead, we can explore how the notion of something like a singular Paiute people emerges through the discursive and institutional networks of officially sanctioned forms of representativity. From this perspective, the question is less does Winnemucca truly speak for the Paiute people, then how does she convey a sense of such peoplehood through rhetorically constructing her own ability to speak as a representative in that people's name? And what is at stake in such a construction? What other forms of indigenous peoplehood present in the late 19th century lie outside the bounds of such dynamics of representativity? From the beginning, life situates Winnemucca within a line of leaderly succession that licenses her speech as a representative for the Paiute people. In the first paragraph of the narrative, she indicates, quote, "My grandfather was chief of the entire Paiute nation," end quote. And when her grandfather, Truckee, a name given to him by whites, returns from having fought in the Mexican-American War in California on the side of the US, he, quote, "told my father to take charge of his people and hold the tribe," end quote. And while Truckee returned to California with about 30 families to work for, in his terms, his white brothers, Winnemucca notes, quote, "My father took his place as chief of the Paiutes and had it as long as he lived," end quote. Later in the narrative, when Truckee is on his deathbed, quote, "he looked at my father and told him what he must do, as he was to be head chief of the Paiute nation," end quote. These moments unequivocally present the Paiutes as an integrated political body under a single leader, and they cast that authority as generationally transmitted, such that Winnemucca occupies a privileged position in communicating Paiute interests and aims to non-natives. She appears to readers as, in her own terms, quote, "the chieftain's weary daughter," end quote. During her public addresses in San Francisco and in the Northeast, both just prior to and in the wake of composing the narrative, Winnemucca indicates that she is touring and speaking to white audiences as an expression of her father's aims and status as leader of the Paiute tribe. In May 1883, the Salem Gazette reported her as having said during one of her lectures, quote, "I come because my father wished me to tell the true story of my people to the world," end quote. Moreover, in a speech the previous September in San Francisco, Winnemucca indicated that the rank of chief, quote, "is inherited from father to son, the oldest son being the chief by law. If he is dead, the one next to him becomes chief. Or if there are no sons, the next male relative, but never a woman," end quote. Even as Winnemucca denies her own ability to assume the chieftainship, her lineage legitimizes her as a spokesperson for the Paiutes as collective, casting her as an appropriate advocate for them with non-native publics. So her grandfather was the chief of the Paiute nation. That position moves to her father. Even though it can't go to her, she is in what's imagined as kind of royal family, and in newspaper accounts throughout the 1870s and 1880s, she's referred to as Princess Sarah, right? So this narrative of her in this lineage of succession, she presents that as licensing her public speech in the name of what she calls the Paiute nation. This way of portraying Paiute governance depends on understanding Chief Winnemucca, Sarah's father, as the undisputed leader of a political structure that encompasses Paiutes stretching from what is now southern Nevada up through southeastern Oregon and east into Idaho. Winnemucca's portrayal of her father and her family in these terms helps create the sense of a clear Paiute chain of command that would facilitate diplomatic negotiations, such as those conducted through the federal government's treaty system. In presenting herself as part of the ruling family, Winnemucca invokes a geopolitical entity over which their authority is extended, the Paiute nation, that supposedly encompasses large swaths of territory in the Great Basin. Quite early in the narrative, she notes, quote, "My people were scattered at that time over nearly all the territory now known as Nevada," end quote. However, Winnemucca does not discuss any coming together of widely separated Paiutes as a body, or a meeting by representatives from groups whose principal dwellings lie far from each other. What appears here to tie them together as a people is their mutual affiliation to Chief Winnemucca, speaking as if there were an underlying entity of which the chiefdom were merely an expression, an encompassing nation with a structure and solidity that precedes and exceeds the role played by Winnemucca's family. I'll let you think about that for a second.
Say it again.
Oh.
If we have to think about it, I just need that last sentence again.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
What appears here to tie them together as a people is their mutual affiliation to Chief Winnemucca, speaking as if there were an underlying entity of which the chiefdom was merely an expression, a Paiute nation, an encompassing nation with a structure and solidity that precedes and exceeds the role played by Winnemucca's family. He's the chief of the Paiute nation because there exists such a thing called the Paiute nation of which he could be a chief, as opposed to the Paiute nation rhetorically exists as an entity through citing her father as the chief of it. Right? One of the ways the text seeks to manage this issue of dispersed governance is by distinguishing between the chief and his sub-chiefs. When discussing her father's warning to the people of the need to flee to the mountains in order to avoid white immigrants, Winnemucca notes, quote, "The sub-chiefs went everywhere to tell their people what my father had told them to say," end quote. And as part of the account of traditional Paiute social life, the narrative explains, quote, "The sub-chiefs are appointed by the great chief for special duties. There is no quarreling about that, for neither sub-chief or great chief has any salary," end quote. Sub-chiefs clearly exist in a hierarchy with the great chief, a position occupied by the men of Winnemucca's family. The sub-chiefs apparently serve at the pleasure of the head chief, acting as extensions of his authority rather than, say, gaining authority by being chosen as leaders by distinct groups of Paiutes. When the narrative shifts its attention to the Malheur Reservation in Oregon, created by Executive Order in 1872, it repeatedly refers to Egan and Oitz, the men characterized as leaders of the Paiutes who live at the Malheur Reservation, as sub-chiefs. However, in addition to the fact that at no point is there any suggestion that either man, Egan or Oitz, was appointed by Winnemucca's father, who still functions in this section of the narrative as the great chief, there is some confusion about the character of Egan and Oitz's status. At one point, while Samuel Parrish, the Indian agent appointed at Malheur, is promoting life on the reservation, he says, quote, "I want you, chiefs of the Paiutes, to ask all your people to come here to make homes for themselves," end quote. And while Winnemucca speaks of Egan and Oitz here as sub-chiefs, Oitz indicates in response to Parrish's request, quote, "I have my men, and our father, Chief Winnemucca, has his," adding, quote, "I and my men have our own work to do, that is to hunt for our children," end quote. Oitz insists on the separateness of their groups of men, rejecting the notion of a singular line of command. Thus, even as the narrative consistently casts Winnemucca's family, and her father in particular, as having an undisputed position of leadership over the Paiutes as a unified polity or people, the text registers tensions in such an account, intimating that political authority may be spread over a wide variety of sites, even having multiple leaders on the same reservation, one chief's men at Malheur versus those of another. The potential absence of a head chief, though, raises questions about the claim to speak for a cohesive Paiute nation, suggesting that the text may participate in the process of generating such an entity, rather than simply reflecting its existence and speaking in its name. Scholars have suggested that in the decades prior to sustained contact with non-natives, there was nothing like a northern Paiute nation, in the sense of having a leadership structure that extended over all northern Paiute groups, or having a clearly delineated territory understood as belonging to such an overarching political body. As Martha C. Knack and Omar C. Stewart argue in their History of the Pyramid Lake Reservation, created in Nevada by Executive Order in 1859, quote, "The Great Basin, unlike California and many other regions of North America, had only a small number of ethnic groups, each using a large territory. These Great Basin ethnic groups were culturally very similar to each other, and none had political organizations of any kind which would have united all members of one group and demarcated them from others. They spoke different but generally related languages, and these formed the primary ethnic markers within the region," end quote. The territory used by these groups extended for approximately 78,000 square miles, and there were over 20 Northern Paiute bands. While distinguished by the particular lands and waters they claimed as their own, the bands did not so much operate as cohesive, discrete geopolitical units as occupy overlapping spheres of use in which each band recognized the other band's rights to control particular areas, even as they regularly sought and were given permission to use them as part of subsistence strategies within shifting Great Basin ecologies. So if a band was recognized as having a particular area of land or water, right, it's not that they dwelled there exclusively, it's not that they were the only ones that use it. Other bands recognized that that band had control over particular land and waters and would ask that band for access. But other folks were routinely given access, just as members of any given band were routinely accessing the land and waters of other bands. So it's not a band as a polity on a delineated land base, which is their primary land base and from which others are largely excluded. That's not the model of collective identity or land tenure in the Great Basin. Michael Allen Gualtieri suggests that, quote, these family or household groups were affiliated via a complex web of intersecting consanguineal and affinal relationships, cooperative foraging relationships, and relationships linking particular population clusters at particular times to transcendental power known as puha itself, end quote. Such a sense of collective identity encompassed a group of extended families who understood themselves as having an enduring connection to a specific land base, even as that us did not provide sustained parameters for the band's annual and regional movements. People throughout the Great Basin developed extensive relations of kinship and trade with each other that allowed individuals and families to draw on resources in a range of spaces that were not associated with the band to which they may have belonged. There is debate then over whether something like the idea of a chief makes sense for talking about Northern Paiute groups and modes of authority prior to the mid-19th century, especially given the size of those bands, the variable composition of who is dwelling where during various parts of the year. So members of bands could be dwelling in the areas associated with any number of other bands at any given point. The ease with which people could change bands, given a range of kinship connections to other groups in the region, and that leadership was a matter of continued popular support rather than institutional investiture or lineage. So Winnemucca suggests that her father inherited the chieftainship from her grandfather. He gave it to her son, that it was passed in this kind of lineage. Evidence suggests that that did not actually exist as a social pattern throughout the Great Basin, that there was no such thing as an investiture, right, through lineage for forms of authority in the bands. Even as Winnemucca's narrative seeks to project a sense of encompassing Paiute political cohesion through the depiction of her family's leadership, the text registers other kinds of authority at play in the Great Basin, which suggests a very different kind of mapping than that of a head chief who could represent a unified nation. Early in the narrative, Chief Winnemucca gathers his people and tells them to retreat to the mountains in response to a dream he had had of waves of white settlers, and the dream comes true. Years later, Natchez, Winnemucca's brother, dreams that some Paiutes who are angry at the behavior of Pyramid Lake's agent will, instead of assaulting the agent, attack a place named Deep Wells, killing one man and taking a number of horses. That action was happening as he was dreaming it. And then also, later in the narrative, Winnemucca dreams that Egan will be treacherously murdered by the Umatillas during the Bannock War, and I'll talk more about the Bannock War a little later, on the very night that event occurs. And she reminds readers, quote, many of my family have seen things in their dreams that were really happening, end quote. The ability to prophesy in this way, or to receive information about what's occurring elsewhere through visions, seems to run in Winnemucca's family, a link that reinforces their suitability for leadership by suggesting that their authority arises from other than human sanction. They're the ones who receive these dreams, are able to prophesy in this way, therefore they have connection to other than human powers, therefore they're justified in being the leaders, leading the lineage of the Paiute nation. Dreaming, though, served more broadly as the basis for shamanic power among native peoples across the Great Basin, indicating a spiritual entity's endowment of greater than ordinary access to puha, the omnipresent forms of energy available in all living things. To be possessed of such increased abilities enabled one to mobilize ambient forms of power to particular ends, especially forms of healing, thereby leading to the figure of the medicine man. As Smoke argues, quote, argues popular belief, quote, in the efficacy of shamanism throughout the period provided the internal logic of the prophetic religions of the 19th century, including both ghost dances. Adding, quote, ghost dances were a community curing rite that promised the restoration of a world free of disease, death, and spiritual disharmony, end quote. The emergence of prophet-led movements that involved thousands of people and spread across the Great Basin and Columbian Plateau, extending at different points into California and onto the plains, testifies to the continuing importance among the Paiutes and neighboring peoples of puha and those who can wield it. Other than the mentions of dreaming and the occasional reference to Paiute doctors and doctoresses, this is in Winnemucca's terms, there is a relative absence of discussion of regular shamanic and spiritually motivated activity in Winnemucca's narrative, a gap underlined by the fact that the text jumps from 1868 to 1875, skipping over the period of greatest attention to Wadziwab's visions, commonly known as the Ghost Dance of 1870. So it just skips the period of the Ghost Dance of 1870 entirely. This evasion by the text can be understood as an effort to bypass the kinds of authority generated through such prophetic practices in favor of a portrait of Paiute collectivity as organized in ways more amenable to Euro-American political forms. However, in addition to referencing the Winnemucca family's dreamings, the text also gestures to the importance of puha in securing chiefly status for both Chief Winnemucca and Oiz. Somewhat buried in the chapter on domestic and social moralities, as it's called, amid the array of Paiute practices and beliefs discussed, Winnemucca notes, quote, "My people capture antelopes by charming them, but only some of the people are charmers. My father was one of them, and once I went with him on an antelope hunt," end quote. And then she goes on to describe the antelope hunt for three pages without really taking any stock of what it means for her father to be an antelope charmer. Right, for him to lead the antelope hunt and the significance of that, right, for northern Paiute people and people in the Great Basin. Since antelope were a major source of subsistence and charming them was understood as a principal way of gathering enough of them to sustain a band or set of bands for the year, having access to an antelope charmer was of great importance as part of annual food strategies, and being such a charmer granted someone considerable authority within and among bands. Bands, as well as sustained relations among them, could take shape around these figures and the forms of power that they employed, very much like Chief Winnemucca. This way of mobilizing puha and the kinds of leadership and collectivity that emerged around and through antelope charming are not equivalent to those gathered around Wadziwab and others who led broader prophetic movements. But there's evidence that Chief Winnemucca also was known for his broader shamanic abilities. Moreover, the rituals surrounding the antelope hunt also involved a round dance, which throughout the Great Basin served as a means of collectively gathering and enacting puha in various annual traditions, including mourning dances among some Paiute groups. And such round dances provided the framework for what would become the central ritual enactment, circle dancing, from which the ghost dance received its name. With respect to Oiz, Winnemucca casts him as a disruptive influence on the Malheur Reservation, while providing tidbits of information that, when attended to, point instead toward him as imbued with shamanic power. Life Among the Paiutes reports that Winnemucca's father and Egan indicated to Agent Parrish, as evidence that Oiz, quote, is a very bad man, end quote, quote, "Our father, we are afraid of Oiz, because he says he can make us all die here. Last winter we had some kind of sickness, and a great many of our children died. He said it was he who was making us sick," end quote. In addition, the narrative notes that Oiz claimed to be immune to bullets, and at another point, in an effort to heal a Paiute child whom Reinhardt, the Indian agent at that point, had assaulted, Oiz, quote, was laying hands, end quote, on the boy, echoing the text's earlier description of treatment by Paiute doctors, quote, "Our medicine man cures the sick by laying on of hands," end quote. These moments point to Oiz's ability to draw on puha, alternately as a shaman to heal and as a witch to injure. These instances direct attention to the challenge that he poses to the agent's control over the reservation, including his initial refusal to labor and his ongoing relationships with what get called the Columbia River Indians. This group is designated as, quote, bad Indians, end quote, due to their refusal to stay within reservation boundaries and their continuance of older regional trade patterns. And while somewhat loose in its field of reference, and I can talk more about this later, the phrase Columbia River Indians repeatedly is used in official US reports to refer to the band led by Smohalla. Smohalla was a mid-19th century leader of Wampum descent who had been a medicine man, eventually gathering a group of followers who at the height of his influence numbered in the thousands, many living with him in an off-reservation area just south of the Columbia River, leading to the running characterization of this collective as the Columbia River Indians. Rising to prominence in the early 1870s and echoing Wadsworth's vision and recommendations, Smohalla called for a return to older ways and a renunciation of white technologies and practices, including the signing of treaties and the acceptance of government demarcated reservation lands. Accounts of whites at the time routinely characterized him as a dreamer, meaning that he specifically was linked to the followers of the prophet Smohalla and to the dissemination of the ghost dance more broadly. The text's depiction of whites, as well as of Chief Winnemucca then, raises the issue of the role of puha in Paiute socio-political formations, modes of leadership, and participation in networks sustained through prophecy, while offering a significantly truncated account of those aspects of Paiute life. So we have this vision of a centralized Paiute nation. We get these little tidbits that point to other geographies of relation, power, collectivity, which do not fit the centralized model, centralized both in terms of leadership and in terms of land base, that Winnemucca's narrative offers as the form of supposed Paiute nationhood. So we get this other vision in the cracks in the narrative, which we can see is associated with the ghost dance and prophet movements. The choice not to discuss such movements within the narrative and their connection to extant Paiute social roles, forms of authority, and modes of interband relation registers the narrative's effort to offer an account of Paiute leadership consistent with the patterns at play in U.S. Indian policy. When speaking of sub-chiefs, Life offers an account of Paiute political identity as integrated across the region. But as discussed earlier, it also indirectly suggests the persistence of a diverse range of northern Paiute bands who have flexible connections to each other without participating in an overarching national entity, a vision of Paiute collectivity or collectivities that appears to be more consistent with historical patterns in the region. How then do we interpret what seems like a disjunction between the narrative and long-standing Paiute socio-political dynamics? More than indicating her father's prominence among the Paiutes, Winnemucca's text repeatedly illustrates how U.S. officials, civilian and military, treat her father as the preeminent leader of the Paiutes as a polity. And the narrative repeatedly provides examples of settler officials insisting on the importance of bringing Chief Winnemucca back to state-managed spaces, reservations, and army bases, when he has refused to stay within their boundaries. However, Chief Winnemucca's authority, leadership of his people, also appears here as partial, as applying only to a limited group of Paiutes who join him in his off-reservation occupancy and movements. During the Bannock War of 1878, which takes up a good deal of the narrative, one of the army officers Winnemucca encounters asks, quote, "If you will go to your father and tell him and his people that they shall be taken care of and be fed, get all the well-disposed of your people to come near the troops where they can be safe," end quote. This moment and similar ones earlier suggest a deep anxiety that her father has hostile intentions and that his consistent movement and residence beyond reservation boundaries indicates a likely challenge to U.S. authority in the region. That fear, which the text indexes, might be understood as having to do with the widespread rumors that her father was participating in prophetic movements through which he was in communication with and inciting Shoshones and Bannocks. Efforts to present Winnemucca's father as the principal chief of the Paiutes and to curtail his movement, to put him in his proper place, bespeak a process of reifying indigenous identity in ways that make it easier to map, understanding all efforts to move beyond reservation-based tribal geographies as a dangerous kind of aberrance in need of containment. The narrative points toward the encompassing character of Chief Winnemucca's power as projected by U.S. officials, even as, in doing so, it indirectly intimates the limits of that power. Such officials seek to draw on Winnemucca's father in order to generate a sense of coherent Paiute identity over which U.S. authority can be exercised through him, positioning him as a metonym whose compliance can signify and enact the bringing to order of Paiute populations. So if Winnemucca is presenting her father as the leader of the entire Paiute nation in a way that authorizes her speech on their behalf, she's not simply inventing this out of a whole cloth. She is engaging already existing discourses of Indian policy in the region, which present Chief Winnemucca as chief of the entire Paiute nation, which works in the interest of US policy aims because it can localize both consent and dissent within this one figure. If we can get his affirmation, then we can control northern Paiute bands. Bringing him to heel in terms of getting him back on the reservation can control the sort of aberrant wanderings of northern Paiute bands. So she's drawing on an existing formulation which of Chief Winnemucca's authority within Indian policy, and that formulation works to the advantage of Indian policy. Reciprocally, Winnemucca cites the Indian services and the Army's use of her father to these ends in ways that reaffirm his role as, quote, head chief of the Paiute nation, end quote, and thus her own legitimacy as the advocate for the Paiute people, as they are representative in interactions with non-native publics. Considering the various ways that the US government positions Chief Winnemucca as the representative for a cohesive Paiute political identity, we might understand that process as seeking to generate a form for Paiute peoplehood more conducive to implementing the discursive and institutional technologies of US Indian policy. In many ways, Winnemucca comes to function as a public and administrative trope through which to coalesce a range of different visions and versions of authority among Paiute groups, constructing and reconstructing and circulating the image of a unified Paiute collectivity over which such power could be exerted. In various accounts by non-natives in the 1860s through the 1880s, including by Indian agents and Army officers, Chief Winnemucca is conflated with Truckee, Sarah Winnemucca's grandfather, and with Numaga, a Pyramid Lake leader also known as Young Winnemucca, who is Chief Winnemucca's nephew. So even in accounts by Army officials and Indian agents where they're speaking about different people, they get conflated as if they're speaking about the same Chief Winnemucca, right? So that Winnemucca becomes this way of, in a range of ways, condensing a range of persons and Paiute political formations into a singular entity and the singular figure of Chief Winnemucca. Life Among the Paiutes draws on the administrative and popular narrative of Chief Winnemucca's ubiquitous authority across Paiute space in order to position the text as a mode of diplomatic engagement. In this way, we might characterize life as enacting a treaty imaginary, conveying the sense that Winnemucca's writing itself surrogates for the absent scene of formal negotiation. U.S. treaty making with Native peoples officially ends in 1871, and the Northern Paiutes did not have any formal treaties with the federal government. However, Winnemucca seeks to generate the sense of a treaty relationship, with her family serving as diplomatic mediators. In Life Among the Paiutes, she references a, quote, treaty giving the Pyramid Lake Reservation to my people, end quote. And in her previous speeches and engagements, she speaks of the Pyramid Lake and Malheur reservations as resulting from treaties, which they did not. Both reservations were created by presidential executive order. But such claims create the sense of an ongoing process of political relation and negotiation that obtains between the Paiutes as a nation and the US government. The narrative elsewhere draws on the sense of a history of entering into agreements with US officials for which the terms are unclear or are not honored. At one point, Winnemucca quotes Jim, a sub-chief from Pyramid Lake, as saying, quote, I'm going to quit signing any paper, for I don't know what I have been signing all these 22 years, end quote. And toward the end of the narrative, Winnemucca asserts, quote, my people have been signing papers for the last 23 years. They don't know what they sign, end quote. Invoking a legacy of treaty making and treaty violation, or at least one of Paiute signing documents whose terms are deceptive in ways that gesture toward histories of treaty manipulation by the US, allows Winnemucca to position the narrative as an effort to engage in a good faith process of negotiation as a kind of treaty substitute. Moreover, in the narrative, she describes the request to travel to Washington, D.C. that she, her father, and her brother received from a U.S. official in the wake of the Bannock War. And in her discussion of their time in the U.S. Capitol, Winnemucca indicates that when meeting with various officials, she and those with her advocated for the return of the non-combatant Paiutes who had been removed to the Yakima Reservation. So in the narrative, she's saying U.S. officials are looking to her family as representative When they were serving as representatives in DC, they were advocating for the Paiute people in various ways. This part of the narrative underlines her and her family's role as officially recognized representatives authorized to speak for the Paiutes. Life Among the Paiutes works to convey the sense of Winnemucca as someone authorized on both sides to serve as a mediator between Paiutes and the US government, seeking to give a diplomatic cast and force to the proposals offered in the text for addressing the settler-orchestrated expulsions and deprivations experienced by Paiute people and peoples. Life Among the Paiutes mobilizes the story of the political status of Winnemucca's family in ways that enable Winnemucca and the text itself to appear as representative, as embodying the collective will of the Paiute people. In doing so, though, the text includes other formations of leadership and identification at play in the region throughout the time period it covers. The powerful influence of forms of shamanic power and prophecy, and the wide-ranging movements to which the latter especially gave rise, prophecy, appear fleetingly in the text. Attending to such ghost dance geographies, though, helps bring to the fore both the constructedness, administrative and textual, of accounts of unified Paiute nationality and the presence of other forms of peoplehood. The production of Paiute as a coherent tribal identity in this way entails separating the Paiute nation from the Columbia River Indians, as discussed earlier, as well as from the Bannocks, who engaged in a war against the US. Even though the Bannocks are portrayed as going to war as a result of being punished for seeking to avenge sexual assaults on Bannock women, Winnemucca distances her people from them, despite ample evidence in the text and elsewhere that many of those who fought with the Bannocks were Paiutes. These differentiations from those who are called bad Indians work to cast her people as a separate entity undeserving of the forms of state-sanctioned management and dispossession they face, right? The Paiutes are not the Columbia River Indians, they're not the Bannocks, they're a unified people. Those other peoples should be punished, not us. Other potentials for Native collective self-understanding in modes of diplomatic, spiritual, and territorial relation need to be effaced if Paiute is to emerge as a coherent object of public policy and advocacy within the terms of extant Indian administration. And here's the conclusion. Attending to the presence of the ghost dances as both a set of occurrences during the events chronicled in the text and as a marker of a significant horizon of Paiute history in the period, though, allows one to appreciate the ways the account of Paiute people had developed within the text, its depiction of a cohesive we, or a tribal family, as it says at one point, led by Winnemucca's relatives, relies on disavowing the social dynamics surrounding and generated by these prophetic movements. Put another way, the text can be read as bending around the eventness of the ghost dance of 1870 and similar prophetic movements in its effort to provide a particular vision or version of Paiute peoplehood. Winnemucca's narrative not only is marked by the strain of doing so, it seeks to implot Paiute history and identity in ways that transform ghost dancing into a non-event, something that does not figure in the ongoing emergence of Paiute national history, as it is characterized within the terms of federal Indian policy. Critically foregrounding the presence of ghost dances and the forms of collective identification that they generated and on which they relied, brings into relief the textual strategies through which Winnemucca seeks to constitute a different kind of we, a representative one that is more conducive to recognition within official discourses of Indianness and to maneuver within the extant terms of settler governance. Thank you. Yes. Yes.
Hi. My name is Rose Jolly, and I have a question, two questions and a comment. The first question is, how would your work on the ratifying, on Wanamaker's ratifying of that national identity intersect in terms of a project on time with Pavanelli's notions of late liberalism, in which you would seem to be extending that project backwards a little bit. And then the second one is Ghost Dawn's prophecy always anti-nationalist, and if so, why?
So
and then I just have a third comment on treaties, which is just that would it not make sense for you to argue that she's not really substituting a treaty, she's substituting written discourse for oral treaty? In terms of the green
right.
grass and running water?
Right? No, because because what she's gesturing towards is a history of legalized diplomatic relation with the government through treaties, and especially where treaties served as the basis for recognizing native land bases, which come to be called reservations. So part of what she's doing in the narrative is pointing to the ways that within Indian policy in the late 19th century, on reservation, where you have an Indian agent, that Indian agent has almost unlimited license to do virtually anything, to restrict food resources, to control who can come and go where, to control who can farm, right, where, to use the Indian police, right, to arrest folks for various violations of federal principles. But the point is that the treaty becomes a way of talking about Native peoples as political entities rather than as racialized dependents on lands gifted to them by the federal government. So treaties are a public language through which to contest the kinds of license exercised through Indian policy. Treaties also become a way of talking about Native peoples as political entities with whom the federal government negotiates, and she is trying to negotiate with the federal government around a range of things, both the ways that policy is exercised on reservation, but also, as I mentioned, the Paiute non-combatants who had been living at the Malheur Reservation in the wake of the Bannock War. Those who hadn't participated in the war are also sent to the Yakima Reservation, which is hundreds of miles away, right? She's trying to get them returned. So there are various things that she's trying to do that involve a negotiation with the federal government, trying for it to be not a sort of informal, but an explicitly legal administrative relationship. In terms of your other questions, that Pavanelli's argument around the status of indigenous peoples in relation to the settler state, Elizabeth Pavanelli is largely writing about Australia, right, Australian policy. And what she's talking about, and I'm going to take up the cunning of recognition rather than sort of her later work, right? And the cunning of recognition, what she's talking, her book, The Cunning of Recognition, what she's talking about is the ways that the recognition of indigenous peoples by the Australian state requires indigenous peoples to perform modes of cultural authenticity, which may or may not have anything to do with their current practices or their past practices, right? But that access to land and to recognize governance over that land is predicated on a cultural performance of authenticity. So legally, in order for the government of Australia to acknowledge native land bases and governance over them, they need to be performing what's imagined as post-contact or early after-contact forms of cultural life. So that so in terms of my argument about Winnemucca, that part of what I'm suggesting is that if Pavanelli and other critics within indigenous studies, so for example, Audra Simpson, Glenn Coulthard, some folks who've been doing this work, Leanne Simpson as well, arguing against recognition by the settler state, right? That to seek to be recognized by the settler state is to seek to have the settler state decide the terms on which indigenous peoples will be understood as having a land base, as governing themselves, the way they'll use that land base, arguing instead for, in Coulthard and Leanne Simpson's terms, for resurgence, right? For a claiming of indigenous landedness, sovereignty, self-determination, which is not in any way routed through the settler state. However, while accepting the intellectual work that they're doing, there's also then the question of, well, then how do you engage with the settler state, especially in historical conditions of direct military violence, right? And so what do those mediations look like? What is the intellectual work of those mediations? And this project, speaking about the people of which this is part, I'm trying to think about that intellectual and political labor, right, that Native writers are engaged in speaking to non-Native publics, whether literally officials or just non-Native persons, to try to get them to engage with the government. So that labor of mediation requires in some way that Native peoples, or the people in question here, the Paiutes, be intelligible to the officials and publics to whom Winnemucca is appealing. So she can't simply jettison non-Native understandings of Indianness, tribeness, etc., because she's trying to make claims both to get the public to move the government, but also to get to move the government, right? To do certain things. So she's speaking in a language that is intelligible to them, one which is not merely rhetorical, one which is, as I suggested, materialized in Indian policy in the Great Basin, including with respect to her father, right? So, but then it's trying to mark the ways that, especially as literary studies folks, when we encounter these texts, right, we may think about them as negotiating various non-native discourses, but the question of what entity are they speaking for? When they're claiming to be representative, what is that relation as intellectual and political labor? I want to dwell within that question rather than treating Paiute Nation as a given, right? And even as scholars with respect to Winnemucca will note that, well, maybe there wasn't a chiefdom, maybe it wasn't really a nation, but then they'll continue speaking in the singular of the Paiute Nation, not thinking about what the recognition of its multiplicity might mean for reading the narrative and the work of the narrative, right? So it's, the ghost dance becomes a way not of suggesting, as I was saying earlier, not a more authentic version of indigeneity, but a version of peoplehood which is not intelligible within the framework to which Winnemucca is appealing. And that she's appealing not because she's sold out or whatever, she's appealing because she's trying to do particular kinds of intellectual and political work and needs representativity as a thing to generate a voice from in order to do that advocacy work. With respect to the ghost dance, it depends on what you mean by nationalist. If you mean the idea of a clearly delineated land base that is controlled by a polity whose membership is clearly distinguished from that of other polities, I would say most ghost dances do not fit that model. Most ghost dances cross tribal boundaries. Most ghost dances, and this is, I'm talking the Great Basin, but also if you think about prophetic movements, right, on lands claimed by the US and Canada as ghost dances, if you include them all within that rubric, right, which I think Gregory Smoke, who I was quoting, I think would lead us to do, not exceptionalize the ghost dance of 1890 and 1870, but see them as part and parcel of other kinds of prophetic movements, that it's often about gathering together regional coalitions of folks that do various things, right? But it's also, as I was trying to suggest, that those prophetic movements, as they emerge in the Great Basin in the late 19th century, aren't completely unlike modes of political and geographic and resource and shamanic relation, which existed prior to the late 19th century. They build on them, they emerge out of them, which is also why one of the things I'm sort of gesturing toward here, which is important, is that prophecy is not an unusual occurrence. Prophecy is not a world-altering change in the state of things. That access to puha, right, was regular, right? Not everyone had it, not everyone had it in the same amount, but it was not unusual to have access to it. So it's the understanding of the ghost dance as this unusual eruptive event, which needs to be explained in terms of these specific historical circumstances of 1870 and 1890, doesn't make sense if one thinks about the social patterns enacted in the ghost dance and their relationship to other patterns in the period that were similar and other patterns before that were similar.
Thank you. Great.
Okay.
Thank you for a very enriching talk. So I don't know the text that you're talking about, and I have a very simple question. And some of it relates back to some of your characterizations. For example, arousing a public or putting ideas in the mind of the public, or actually seeking to convince government officials, right? So these are two different rhetorical aims, two different audiences. So I'm just wondering, and you've referred to it as a narrative, most of your quotes would point to life writing as opposed to a pamphlet or some kind of a political petition. So I'm just wondering if
it literally had a petition at the end. There's a petition
So,
at the end that people could sign and send it. So it's I'll let you finish. I'm sorry.
okay, yeah, exactly. If you could say a little bit more about, place it generically. So you've already said it's a little bit of hybrid, but also where it was published, and anything about the readership around the time that it was published.
I wouldn't characterize it as a hybrid, because I think characterizing it as a hybrid assumes that the sort of genres that we would understand as mixed in it were themselves coherent and isolated in the 19th century, or in native writing, which they weren't, right? And I'm talking about native publishing, right, in English. So it tells the story of her life, it tells the history of the Paiute people, what's happening around Pyramid Lake in the 1840s through the mid-1860s, what's happening at Malheur from the mid-1870s through to the early 1880s. It has a chapter, which is a kind of quasi-ethnographic chapter, where it talks about social and domestic moralities. I believe that's the actual title of it. I quote from it in here, where it's just like, here are some Paiute traditions, right? So it appears as a generic mishmash, but what it really is the gathering together of a range of different kinds of speeches which she'd been making over the prior 10 years, that she had been lecturing extensively in Nevada and California, and right before the publication of the text and just in its wake, she was lecturing in the Northeast, and literally did hundreds of lectures within a period of about a year and a half. So it's a cobbling together of lectures. So it actually, what it would most resemble is this sort of popular lecture circuit, right? And sort of moving together and given newspaper accounts, because Winnemucca had been covered in newspapers in the Great Basin in Nevada, but also elsewhere. Like her name shows up in the New York Times, right? Starting like the 1860s, right? So, and she had been lecturing and being covered in newspapers long before she publishes this. And if you look at the accounts in those newspapers of what she was talking about, it's what's in the narrative, right? So she clearly sort of brought things together. In terms of publication, it's published. It's in the Northeast. I want to say Boston. Yeah, I believe it's Boston. And it's part of her sort of Northeastern tour when she'd been in the Northeast, visiting DC in like around it's like 1880-ish. She had come into contact with folks who were involved in benevolent societies, right? Especially those who had previously been abolitionists, but then there were a number of people who have been abolitionists who in the wake of the Civil War take up the Indian problem, right? And often they style themselves Friends of the Indian. That was literally an organization. But that she connects with the Peabody sisters, which includes they're the sisters of Nathaniel Hawthorne's wife, which is how they sort of come into visibility within scholarship, but they were involved in all sorts of good causes in terms of education, in terms of abolition before the war, in terms of the Indian problem. And she lives with them, they help support her, they help introduce her to publication networks, right? She was very familiar with print culture before that, but just in terms of literally finding a publisher, right? They help with that. Readers that she's selling the book at her lectures, right? That I think it's Elizabeth Peabody, one of the Peabody sisters, helps distribute it to members of Congress. So I don't think that it's and I think she carries it with her. I think that when she returns to Nevada, but I think the largest circulation is to sort of benevolent figures and audiences of her lectures in the Northeast in order to get them to influence what's happening in Congress. In order to, and there, as I mentioned, there is in fact a petition, right, for folks to sign. She had people signing petitions at her lecture, so this is explicitly part of a public campaign that she's involved in order to deal with abuses within the Indian agent system, get non-combatants back from Yakima, also to try to secure an additional Paiute reservation, because the Malheur reservation was being closed. And she wanted to get one nearer to where her father lived, even in the wake of his death. She was trying to get one nearer where her father had lived. But so the petition speaks to all those things, but is a public political campaign that the narrative emerges from, and the narrative generically emerges from her lectures.
I think we are almost running out of time. Thanks again.